Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our fourth episode of How to Get Away with Staffing. I'm Colin LeBeau, president of Foxhire. Super excited to be here with you guys. And I've got some people from my team, John Lindesmith and Jamie Henry. We're going to have a quick chat about some stuff that a lot of our customers and a lot of the people in our industry typically face, and that's working with MSPs and VMSs. They're always fun, aren't they, guys?
Oh yes. There's a lot of opportunity here though. That's what I kept coming back to eventually is the opportunity, not necessarily the challenges. So
That's right. That's
we'll
I
get
right.
like
into
the
both.
positive mindset. Yes. Cool. So, yeah, MSPs, VMSs, as with everything in the staffing contingent work space, it's always about the acronyms. Let's just start with what those things stand for, what those things are. So what is an MSP? What is a VMS?
Yeah, so an MSP is a managed service provider. So these oftentimes are what we think of as like the programs that act as the conduit between the client, so the organizations that need staff, and then the suppliers, so the agencies that are able to supply the staff, right? So it's really, they're primarily like people and processes and are actively doing hands-on management of the client's needs for staffing. And they may or may not use a VMS, a vendor management system. So when you think about VMSs, they're largely referring to like software, right? So a VMS is typically going to be some sort of like technology, some sort of platform used to manage your contingent workers. A lot of MSPs actually have their own VMSs. Some of them even license those for use outside of the MSP. Some MSPs use multiple different VMSs. And you can use a VMS without the MSP, right? So it can be licensed to different healthcare systems, et cetera, for use with their own internal teams and not have to have the MSP oversight.
Okay. So what I'm hearing you say is MSPs are people and processes to make, outsource my contingent labor, staffing, vendor management stuff, right? Like you guys handle it. We got to worry about other stuff. You guys go handle that. Then I heard you say the vendor management system is a software that makes that process easier, right? And I could use the software myself as an HR director or director of talent management or a procurement person, right? Or I could hire an MSP to do it and they might use a VMS system. That's what I'm sort of hearing you say.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Got it. Okay. So what's the value to me if, let's just start with, if I'm a client of staffing services, if I'm a buyer of staffing services, what's the value to me? Like, why are MSP and VMS vendors so prolific in the space right now? Like, what's the value that they're getting from the service?
So
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, go for it, John.
other than making everyone's life difficult, is that what you're saying, Colin?
Yes. I don't think.
No.
Yeah. Yes.
No. In all seriousness, like their jobs to come in and really like look at the processes that the client has in place for their hiring and like tighten up those processes so that the clients can ultimately get the best talent that they possibly can at like the most cost effective rates. Like that's kind of when I was thinking about that question, how I summed it up in my brain. Because it really, they drill down on the processes. They do a great job of like, we'll focus on this part of it. And then it lets the company kind of manage all the other tasks that they have to manage, like as it comes to their hiring. So that's kind of what I summed it up. Jamie, did you have a couple other examples that you had thought of?
Yeah, that's a fantastic summary, John. And I think one of the biggest ways we see VMSs being leveraged either with or without the MSP is standardizing the onboarding process to the client's needs, right? So this lets the client have access to a larger and more diverse supplier pool than they would if they were trying to, manage it all internally or without the use of the VMS, but still having the standardization as far as making sure all of those onboarding requirements are met to their specifications for each and every hire.
Got it. And I think a lot of the messaging that they push out to their prospective clients through their websites and marketing efforts, the VMSs and MSPs, that is cost control, right? Cost control is something that they feel they're delivering with that. Would you guys tend to agree, or like, are we actually seeing cost control happen?
It's definitely how they market the service. Yeah, it's a big part of what we see on their websites, right? Right, John?
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I mean, they definitely limit markups and decrease probably a lot of the costs. There could be some hidden things in there that they're not accounting for, but certainly cost containment's like a huge part of why a client would see an MSP or a VMS being really beneficial to them.
Right. And I feel like also time to fill, which is a big statistic that a lot of hiring managers, recruiting agencies track, right? How quickly can they get a candidate in? Having that, the ability to send out job requisitions quickly and it hit all the suppliers, right? The staffing vendors, that is, instantly via the software, seemingly does increase the amount of, or decrease the amount of time it takes to get somebody on assignment. So those are some of the things that I've seen as well, from the MSP VMS world. So, okay, that's what the clients get from it. What are the staff firms experiencing?
Can I just have one more thing that the clients are getting real quick that popped into my head? Like, it helps. I mentioned helping the internal HR team and the hiring managers, because I mentioned this on a couple previous podcasts that I've been on, but like hiring is like really hard. And I feel like it should be like a drinking game. Every time I say hiring is hard, audience drink, but like hiring is really tough. Like there's a lot of stuff that goes into it. So if you're thinking like your HR team as a client trying to manage hiring on top of all the other day-to-day things that they're trying to do, like as an HR department, it's like a full-time job plus some for some people. So being able to have the VMS or MSP come in there and help manage those processes for you has like a ton of value as a client, as they're trying to like, let's focus on the things that I'm really going to focus on for like our internal team, and have the VMS MSP help me with hiring that external talent that I need to help fill those roles.
Yeah, agreed. People forget about all the other stuff. Like, well, doesn't HR handle hiring? It's like, yeah, well, they also handle like conflict resolutions, benefits administration, onboarding, offboarding, 401k, training. Like, there's so many things that they have to do that recruiting and hiring, for whatever reason, I don't know why, just isn't always the top thing that they're concerned about. Maybe because a lot of the other stuff they're focused on is compliance driven, so there's an actual penalty if you don't do it right. But yeah, definitely see that a lot. So they're getting a lot of the value from the MSPs, from the VMSs. What are the staffing vendors experiencing when they bump into a client that uses this type of service?
I think one of the biggest things when we meet with agencies that are looking at contracting with MSPs, we have found that the best way to set them up for success is make sure they understand up front exactly what interacting with that MSP or VMS is going to look like, right? So again, we just identified that one of the reasons clients like this is the standardization. Well, in order to ensure that that standardization continues, the MSP and VMS really can't permit a lot of redlining, right? So like we always tell our agencies, hey, take a close look at that contract, understand exactly what you're seeing there. We can ask for clarification if there's something that's not understood, but it's unlikely that we're going to be able to redline it. So it's kind of a take it or leave it situation. As far as the contract goes, right? So that means, anything in that contract related to the onboarding, whether it be like what's required, who bears the cost, cost of training time, any warranties, penalties, et cetera, for contracts that fall through. Those are things that the agencies have to understand what they're signing and know in advance whether or not that's something they feel they can take on, because the reality is they're not going to have the opportunity to negotiate it like you might if you were going directly to the client. So that is one of the biggest things that we kind of like to put on people's radar ahead of time. The other thing too, like you pointed out, these clients are looking to get their employees onboarded quickly, right? So that's the other thing, is it's going to be a tight timeline. It's a tight timeline, and it's often competitive to fill because of those tight timelines, right? So, we're always telling people you want to be building that candidate pool. You kind of want to have those people waiting in the wings. Like if these are the typical standard onboarding items, don't wait until your employee gets accepted to start making sure that they have those things. Be doing that in advance, right? To know what they're, whether it's licenses, education, certifications, whatever's needed for the role, have that as a part of your screening process as you're building your talent pool, because you're going to have to produce it pretty much on demand in order to have your applicant first accepted and then be onboarded within their time frame. So those are the big things we try to highlight for our agencies.
So what I'm hearing you say is process. Like, you got to follow their process. Whatever that VMS or MSP is saying is the process, cannot necessarily be manipulated, or else they lose what value they deliver to the client, right?
That's exactly right. You could add that to John's game. That's our next word, process.
Process.
Yes,
right.
follow the process. So that's
right.
and every VMS or MSP has a different process. So if you're
That's
working
correct.
multiple, makes things more difficult, right? Knowing how to engage properly.
I think
go
ahead, Jamie. Sorry.
I think you're going to say what I was. Go for it.
No, I'm probably not. I was changing a little bit, but you go first.
So what I was going to say is, Colin, that's an excellent point. That's the other thing that we like to tell agencies is, the VMS is always going to look different, or MSP, right? Even if it is the same VMS you've used through a previous MSP or client, it can look a little different depending. So it is a learning curve each and every time. Some provide a tremendous amount of training that you have to do ahead of time. Vector, for example, Vector has like a training course that you go through and get certified in, which is time consuming, but then you really know how to use that VMS well, right? Others, you really don't get training, and you got to get in there and get it figured out so that you know exactly what to do, because it's going to look different with everyone that you work with.
Yes.
And that's kind of perfect segue into what I was going to say, is that, like, if you pay attention to those trainings, and it's a huge opportunity as a staffing firm to get into a VMS and do a really good job at it. And if you can do a really good job at it, it will open up so many different types of opportunities for you to make placements that you might not have even known were going to be available to you without the VMS or MSP's help. So that's, like, everyone kind of says, like, it's so hard to work with these VMSs. That could be because people aren't putting in the time and resources to make sure that they're doing it the proper way, because there is process. But if people can follow those processes, then, I mean, you can just be pumping the candidates through to the VMS and just making placement after placement after placement. So I would really encourage them to take those trainings, learn the VMSs, focus on one, and then that will lead them to more business in the future.
Yeah,
that's such a good point.
The biggest thing there, John, that stands out to me is, first of all, it takes some level of maturity as an organization, a staffing organization, to be able to execute well an MSP program, or execute well using a VMS software because of those processes. And there's a lot of components of that process that deal with multiple facets of a staffing firm's delivery model, like compliance, payroll, insurance. Like, there's so many pieces of the puzzle that what I'm hearing you say is it creates a great opportunity. Tons of job openings, tons of opportunity to make placements. However, we also are aware as an EOR that supports vendors that MSPs and VMSs can look extremely attractive. There's tons of job openings, tons of opportunity in there, but if you're not mature enough, sometimes it can be a waste of time. So I guess my question would be is, does an MSP or VMS program represent an opportunity for maybe startup staffing firms? Like, is that where they should spend their time? Is that the golden ticket for them to start getting job orders? Or do they have to focus elsewhere first before they're mature enough to do well in an MSP program?
I think it depends on their approach, right? So one of the things that I would say to that is MSPs by themselves are not necessarily the issue. Where we see some newer agencies struggle is with this idea of getting into as many MSPs as possible, right? The thought process of like expanding that opportunity as broadly as they can. And you come up against a lot of challenges in that situation, right? Like, you are competing for those job orders. So you have to be in there consistently. You have to move quickly. Where we typically see the greatest success, even with our really mature staffing firms, is when they have, one or two MSPs or VMSs that they focus on, and they focus on a particular niche of staffing in those areas, right? So, it's largely because they can also build a better candidate pool that way, right? So you've got more people ready to submit to those openings. And what I think a lot of newer agencies often don't fully recognize yet is that they're going to be scored by the MSP. And those scores really matter. It goes back to what John just said. If you take that and rather than view it as a challenge, you take it as an opportunity to deliver and deliver well, they're going to continue opening higher and higher tiers, and you're going to get access to more job orders. You get access to higher level job orders, which typically have better margins, and you get access to them sooner than other agencies do. So you have an opportunity to submit your candidate before the other agencies do. But a lot of that comes down to your delivery and your scoring. And so you've got to have those higher scores. So if you're spread too thin, you're not as likely to have the kind of scores that are going to keep you competitive. And for that matter, we're seeing some of the biggest MSPs start to cut their suppliers based on performance. So rather than just score them, there's a threshold, right? And if you're not meeting that minimum threshold, you're actually being taken out of the MSP supplier pool and losing your access altogether.
Right. So if you spread yourself too thin and you think I'm just going to get as many job orders as possible, you're not really going to be able to deliver on any of the programs. And then likelihood is you're not going to be able to expand, or worse, you might get cut out.
And we've seen quite a few firms that appeared really strong right out of the gate, spread themselves too thin across multiple MSPs and not be able to achieve the level of success that they had hoped for in any of them because of it. So.
Right. And I think, go ahead, John.
I was just say I've heard multiple like larger staffing firms talk about their approaches to VMS and MSPs, and they have entire sections of their company that all they have to do is get based off of scoring well on these quote unquote tests that these VMSs and MSPs throw out there. Because if they don't do well, then they don't get this whole section of their business putting more placements. So I think it's a lot easier as you expand, like as you grow, to obviously present more resources to these opportunities, and it might not be as fruitful if you're just trying to focus as a 1 to 2 person staffing firm type of thing.
And getting back in is almost impossible. So once you're in there, you got to perform. Otherwise, what was their last scorecard? Yeah, probably not.
That's so true. Yeah,
they're not going to get back in. So once you're in, you got to make sure that you're going to execute on that, because it's more like a marriage than it is like a dating game. Because you can't go back once you're doing it. So I think a good question here is like, okay, if I'm a recruiting firm that's never interacted with an MSP, or I'm a new firm or whatever, where do we see the most MSP VMS market penetration, market share? Like where are they most prevalent at? Like what industries would you say adopt MSP VMS the most?
We see it a lot in healthcare. It's always been fairly prominent in healthcare, but the pandemic certainly impacted those numbers even more so. I think the latest numbers we've seen is for the healthcare industry is roughly 70 to 80% of all clients in the healthcare space have some level of involvement with an MSP or VMS.
Okay, so basically almost the entire market is. So if you're a healthcare staffing firm, the likelihood that you engage with MSP or VMS program is pretty high.
Yeah, it's pretty high.
Got it. Okay. Any other industries that also have adopted it that you would say is higher than normal?
I've seen like the financial industries sometimes have some VMS MSPs involved in some of their, bids that they throw out there. So I would be another industry that kind of popped into my head. Colin, I don't know if you have any others that you had thought of.
Yeah, I feel like, finance and accounting and technology. Technology is big. You've got a lot of project work in technology. So you've got a lot of MSP, VMS involvement in that for all different types of technology workers, implementation people, software developers, et cetera. So that would be the only other industry I would highlight. And some of the vendors in that area would be like Artec or Magnet, Beeline, Carousel. Those come to mind. What about the healthcare vendors, Jamie? What would be the ones that you most find in the healthcare space?
Yeah, there's quite a few big names, but some of the most prominent we see are like Allegis, Aya, AMN, HWL, so Healthcare Workforce Logistics has been one we've seen more often lately. DNA, they do more in like the skilled nursing space, but they have a large client base in like skilled care and long-term care. Right sourcing is another one that we see a lot with healthcare, and Career Path too. Career Path does both healthcare and a lot of like allied health for like schools and things.
Right. Yeah. Career staff.
Career staff. Yes, thank you. Yep.
Okay, because like a career path, that's a new one. Okay, so career staff. So those are the MSP programs, right? Those are the vendors those are the people and processes, right? And they all for the most part use a software. So what about the softwares, the VMS softwares that you might bump into?
Yeah.
SAP Fieldglass is one that pops into my mind, I think.
Yeah, I think they have the most market share of any VMS.
Yeah, we see that a lot because they're all over the place, it seems like.
Right.
We've worked with ShiftWise before, I believe. That seems pretty prominent, especially in the healthcare industries. Magnet, Blue Sky, and then Jamie, I don't know if you had any other ones that you had in your mind or wanted to go into any of those.
No, those are the big ones. Those are the ones we primarily see. And what's interesting with field glass is it's the one that we tend to see across industries too, right? So not just healthcare. We see field glass in the technology space as well as another place where we've interacted with it.
Got it. Okay, so let's say I'm in this space and I'm starting to engage with these vendors. What are some of the things that I need to watch out for? What are some of the things that I need to be aware of that could maybe not be super apparent to me up front that I need to prepare myself for? Maybe contract language, maybe how to engage with them, any of that stuff that you guys would say comes to mind.
Jamie mentioned a lot of like the contract related stuff earlier when she was kind of going into some of the specifics of like what staffing firms and how they work with them. Some of the other challenges kind of that I would think about is like time and resources to maintain the relationship, like we talked about. Like it's going to take time and potentially dedicated resources to continually manage your scorecards and make sure that you're actually like hitting, what the VMS or MSP are expecting. If you spread yourself too thin, you could be learning numerous systems at the same time, which again, it takes a lot of time potentially. I think those are, I guess the other one I wanted to mention that just popped is like clients transitioning to a VMS or MSP. So like that can be kind of a challenge, especially if you've had a relationship with your client for a long time and they've decided to switch over to like this type of model. It's going to be completely different. And I would encourage you, like, obviously you want to keep that client and I would maintain that relationship, even if you don't want to play as much in the VMS MSPs. Because we do see a lot of, high regret buyers with this kind of tech implementation for some of these, especially healthcare clients that, might eventually get rid of the VMS or MSP. And if you're maintaining your relationships with your contacts, whether it's HR or hiring managers at that particular client company, that will allow you to, maintain your relationship as they transition over to a VMS or MSP, as well as, take that relationship back if they ever decide to, part with that relationship for whatever reason.
Yeah, those MSP programs will protect their client relationship pretty strongly, in some cases preventing you from having any conversations with the hiring managers that you may have already sold to in the past. That is one of the things that I was thinking about, is like limited access to your client. You may not be able to actually sell directly to them. You just got to work through the system. You don't have the benefit of talking to the hiring manager about the job. You don't have the benefit of understanding their, criteria, how your candidate may be doing in the process. Like none of that traditional recruitment insight and feedback from the client. So that's something to consider. I think also like there's some warranties and penalty language in the contract that could put you at risk. So when you sign a contract with a client, you're thinking, cool, this is my opportunity to get a payday. I'm about to go make a placement, get a check. Well, that may be true, but also if your candidate doesn't show up to the assignment, you could be on the hook for a penalty fee, right? I think like 40 hours worth of the bill rate or 80 hours worth of the bill rate if your person doesn't show up, or if they quit early, or if they do any number of things that could be outlined in the contract. You got to be really careful that you understand that risk that you're taking on when you sign up with a VMS or an MSP program, because their job is to make the client's experience as seamless as possible and as risk-free as possible. So they defer all of that risk to the recruiting agency themselves. And if you don't know that up front, you can get yourself into a pretty bad spot.
Yeah. Colin, similar to that, which it's often different than how we handle things when we don't have an MSP. The MSP or VMS is going to limit the hours billed to the client to only those hours worked, right? So there are exceptions. Some permit expense reimbursement or per diem, but most do not. They want an all-inclusive bill rate. And I would tell you that we're seeing the trend head in that direction. So it's an all-inclusive bill rate, right? Now you can structure that bill rate however you see fit. So, you can account for your expenses and your per diem in those bill rates. But what we see some of our recruiters can get into some trouble with is wanting to offer per diem, because often that is the employee's preference. But then the employee gets sick, can't work, and they're still owed the per diem because they're at the work site. IRS says we have to pay, right? But we can't bill the VMS is self-invoicing off of that employee's timesheet, and they're not working. So that client's not covering any portion of that. So there are some ways to work around that. We've kind of developed some different ways that we advise our agencies to consider structuring their expense reimbursements to protect against that a little bit. But it is something that is kind of a change in the way of thinking for a lot of our agencies.
Yeah, because if you went through a scenario plan, you could position yourself to understand that, like, let's say you did all the onboarding for a candidate and that cost you $200, $300 to do the background check, drug screen.
That's more.
Immunization.
That's conservative.
Yeah, that's conservative. So it could be $500, $600, $700,
Yes.
But let's just say you did do the onboarding, and let's just call it $500 to onboard a candidate, right? All this stuff that the VMS requires in the contract, you to supply all this documentation that you did this onboarding process. And then they don't show up to work on the first shift, and you have to pay 80 hours with the bill rate at $100 an hour, right? Like, that's $8,500 that you just lost, right? Like,
or they do show up and they go through orientation, and the contract
Right.
says that you
You had to
can't
pay
bill for
orientation.
orientation. So
Yeah.
so we have to pay that employee because they're there and they're working, but we can't bill the client for it. So that's something to bear in mind too. And we have certainly seen it where they get through all or part of orientation and say, it's not for me, and walk, and you still have to pay them for that orientation time, and you haven't
Yes.
recognized profit. In addition to, those VMS fees that we haven't brought up yet, but are often what we hear about. So lots of upfront costs, lots of ongoing cost. But again, like John said, we're looking at those as challenges. If you think about the flip side of it, the opportunity aspect of it, you have access to these clients that you haven't had to try to solicit yourself, right? Like, you haven't put the time and the effort into making those relationships and those connections and figuring out who the right person to contact is. And if you can get in and deliver well and score well, you can get access to even more clients. So
it puts the onus on the recruiting firm to, they talk about working a desk, right? Like, selling new business development almost goes away, or is much more limited to just focusing on a couple key accounts, i.e. MSP programs, and simply spending all of your time finding the best people possible and refining your onboarding process and all that stuff. So, not to be discouraged, there's great opportunity, but also there's quite a bit of risk. So understanding those risks, I think, is really, really important. But ultimately, if you want to sell in healthcare or even in IT or finance, you're probably going to run into some of these players. So the main message here, I think, is eyes wide open, understand what you're signing up for, don't spread yourself too thin, and you can perform well in an MSP VMS program. And as the MSP VMS programs mature their offerings, I think the relations between vendors and buyers through their third-party services will get better over time, especially with technology. I think that's going to help. And it's just going to take a little bit more time for that to happen, but it's not going away. MSP VMS is here today.
And we're already seeing that relationship improve. I mean, the API documentation helps incredibly. There's tons of partnerships that they're creating with numerous different vendors. It makes, everyone wants to make the experience as good as possible for everybody, because ultimately, clients need these people to work, and we want these candidates that are coming through the VMSs to be as satisfied as possible with the whole process. So
it's a win-win for everybody if it goes well, But if it doesn't go well, that's when it's sort of usually risk-wise gets deferred to the vendor. So just be aware of that, and you'll perform well in there. So hopefully you found this conversation helpful. Happy to answer questions more directly. If you have anything about MSP VMS, feel free to reach out to us. This has been another episode of How to Get Away with Staffing. We hope you have a great day. Thanks so much.